You begin with the assumption that knowledge secures truth. You move through life trusting that what you call understanding is firm, that your conclusions are reliable, and that your mind, when convinced, stands on solid ground. Yet this confidence has rarely been examined. You rarely question the mechanism through which certainty is formed. You accept the feeling of clarity as proof of clarity itself. Al-Ghazali confronted this very point. Early in his inquiry, he noticed that the mind protects its judgments even when they rest on habit rather than verification. In raising the question of certainty, he forces you to consider that the mind may be the first source of distortion, not the last. The judge may be partial without knowing it. If the mind is the judge, who judges the mind? Al-Ghazali lived in a world where intellectual prestige defined authority. Baghdad drew scholars from every discipline: law, philosophy, theology, dialectic. Each school defended its system as the rightful path to truth. In this environment, argument was currency, and mastery of logic was considered mastery of reality. Yet Al-Ghazali observed a deeper issue. Every system began by assuming its own legitimacy. Philosophers trusted reason, theologians trusted revelation, mystics trusted inner states. None questioned the source of certainty itself. By noticing this unexamined foundation, he positioned himself at a point outside the debate. If every system assumes itself correct, how can correctness be known? You see how easily you trust your senses, your recollections, and your conclusions. Yet Al-Ghazali recognized that each of these can fail. Senses deliver impressions that later prove false. Recollection reshapes itself. Reasoning can become circular without revealing its circularity. He realized that the mind can feel certain even when it is mistaken, and this feeling is not itself evidence. Al-Ghazali's crisis was not emotional but structural. It was the recognition that nothing the mind uses to confirm truth is capable of confirming itself. Each method relies on assumptions it cannot justify. You begin to understand how fragile unexamined certainty can be. If certainty can be felt without truth, what is certainty worth? You rely on reason because it seems precise. It builds arguments step by step, and each step appears supported by the previous one. You believe that the structure of logic mirrors the structure of reality. But Al-Ghazali examined the foundations of reasoning itself and found that reason, while powerful, has boundaries. He noted that reason depends on principles it cannot prove: identity, non-contradiction, causation, continuity. These laws are assumed to be self-evident, yet their self-evidence is not an argument. They are accepted because rejecting them would make thinking impossible, not because they have been verified. Reason, therefore, begins with trust, not demonstration. You begin to see that your reliance on logical coherence is actually reliance on unexamined axioms. Arguments appear strong only because the starting points are never questioned. Reason can clarify what follows from its premises, but not whether the premises themselves correspond to reality. This is not a condemnation of rationality. It is an acknowledgement of its domain. Reason operates within what it presupposes. It cannot reach beyond its own framework to justify the framework itself. If logic depends on what cannot be proven, how logical is logic? You notice that your conclusions change when your state of mind changes. When you are calm, ideas appear coherent. When anxious, the very same ideas seem unstable. This reveals that the validity of reasoning is tied to the condition of the one who reasons. Al-Ghazali paid close attention to this subtle connection. He concluded that true understanding requires purification of perception, not in a mystical or symbolic sense, but as a direct refinement of awareness. He argued that beyond the senses and beyond abstract reasoning, there is a faculty capable of immediate recognition, not through inference but through clarity of perception itself. This faculty is not irrational. It is pre-rational, in the sense that it grounds rationality. When the inner state is distorted by desire, fear, or pride, reasoning bends to serve those distortions. When the inner state is clear, reasoning aligns with reality instead of defending assumptions. You begin to see that knowledge is not merely the content of thought, but the condition of the knower. Without inward transparency, even accurate thinking becomes unreliable. If you must purify the self to know truth, who purifies the purifier? You often define yourself by what you can explain. You form an identity around intellectual competence, confidence, and coherence. But Al-Ghazali realized that this identity is fragile. It rests on conclusions that might not withstand scrutiny. He had achieved exceptional scholarly authority. His arguments were respected, his mastery was acknowledged. Yet he saw that none of this guaranteed truth. His intellectual persona depended on the very certainty he was now questioning. When he recognized that his knowledge lacked foundation, the persona built around that knowledge collapsed. This collapse was not a breakdown but a revelation. He withdrew from public life not out of fear but out of necessity. He could no longer teach what he no longer trusted. Instead, he turned inward to examine what remains when intellectual identity dissolves. You begin to understand this movement. When the self constructed from concepts becomes unstable, you are forced to confront what is not constructed. The collapse of the intellectual persona exposes a deeper layer of being that is not defined by argument or achievement. Al-Ghazali's retreat became an inquiry into the essence of certainty. He sought the point at which truth becomes undeniable, not through reasoning but through direct recognition. If the self is built from knowledge, what remains when knowledge is dismantled? You often check your beliefs by asking whether they seem reasonable or socially supported. But Al-Ghazali proposed a different test. Can a belief withstand examination once stripped of all external reinforcement? If approval, belonging, fear, and habit are removed, does the belief still stand? His method of inner verification begins with clearing away distortions, desire that shapes perception, fear that narrows it, pride that defends conclusions, and comfort that resists revision. These are not moral issues but epistemic ones. They influence what the mind is willing to see. Al-Ghazali insisted that knowledge becomes trustworthy only when the knower becomes transparent. This transparency is not passivity, it is the active removal of internal bias. You begin to see that truth is not established by argument but by alignment, the alignment of awareness with what is free from interference. Inner verification does not reject rationality. It completes it. It ensures that reasoning arises from clarity rather than from the concealed motives of the self. When this alignment occurs, understanding becomes direct and reliable, not because it is defended but because nothing remains to distort it. If truth depends on the state of the knower, can truth ever be separated from the self? You often assume that a well-structured argument guarantees a sound conclusion. Yet you also know that people can argue persuasively for positions they later abandon. This reveals that reasoning can justify almost anything when guided by unexamined motives. Al-Ghazali understood this deeply. He observed that logic is a tool, and like any tool, its usefulness depends on the one who uses it. If the inner state is clouded, logic becomes a servant of confusion. It does not correct the distortion, it organizes it. If the inner state is clear, logic becomes a precise instrument of understanding. You begin to see the distinction. Logic can refine thought, but it cannot reveal truth unless the soul is transparent. Meaning, purpose, and certainty cannot emerge from argument alone. They arise when reasoning aligns with an undistorted awareness. This is the central claim behind the idea that logic fails the soul. Logic does not fail because it is flawed. It fails because it cannot reach the depth where transformation occurs. It cannot supply clarity when clarity must come from within. If reasoning can justify anything, what distinguishes truth from convenience? You notice that the more you seek certainty in concepts, the more elusive it becomes. Each argument leads to another question. Each conclusion exposes the assumptions behind it. Al-Ghazali experienced this as a kind of intellectual exhaustion, not from effort but from the recognition that the search for certainty in thought alone is endless. The turning point came when he stopped demanding that truth conform to his reasoning. Instead, he examined the source of reasoning itself. He discovered that certainty is not constructed by the mind but revealed when the self becomes quiet enough to register reality without distortion. This realization is subtle. It does not come from an argument or a demonstration. It emerges as a shift in perception. You begin to see that truth is not an object to be grasped but a condition that arises when interference ceases. The mind cannot force clarity, it can only stop obscuring it. At this point, reason finds its proper role, not as the master of truth but as its servant. Awareness becomes the ground, thought becomes its expression. If truth appears when you stop searching, what was the search for? You arrive at the point where further analysis adds nothing. The mind recognizes its limits. Reason has taken you as far as it can, and its boundaries are now clear. Al-Ghazali's insight becomes evident. Truth is not seized, it is recognized. It does not depend on argument, it is revealed when argument ends. You understand that certainty is not the product of intellectual effort, but the result of an unobstructed awareness. When the need to defend a position dissolves, clarity appears by itself. No claim is made, and nothing is asserted. The search quiets because the searcher is no longer grasping. If truth requires no defender, what remains for the mind to do?